There comes a moment in every person's life when desperation makes choices we never thought we'd face. For Martha Jane Holloway, that moment came on a bitter February night in 1887, when an empty pantry drove her to a smoky saloon with her last few coins. The 58-year-old widow sat at that card table with nothing left to lose. When the final hand was dealt, she didn't win gold or land. She won Luke McGraw, a towering cowboy working off his own gambling debts. At first, she figured he'd be more trouble than help on her struggling homestead. But Luke proved different, mending fences without being asked and never once treating her with pity. What happens when a woman who's forgotten how to hope discovers that sometimes life's greatest gifts come wrapped in unexpected packages? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wind carved through the Wyoming territory with the persistence of a preacher's sermon, finding every gap in Martha Jane Holloway's weathered cabin and reminding her that winter had teeth. She pulled Samuel's old wool coat tighter around her shoulders as she stood at the kitchen window, watching the sun struggle through another grey February morning. The coat still smelled faintly of him, tobacco and leather, and something indefinably warm that she'd never been able to name. 3 years had passed since consumption took him, yet she still caught herself setting 2 plates for breakfast. Her fingers traced the gold wedding band that had grown loose on her finger over the harsh months. Samuel had worked those fingers into calluses during their 23 years together, building this homestead from nothing but prairie grass and stubborn hope. Now those same hands shook slightly as she counted the few remaining beans in the mason jar, calculating how many more meals she could stretch from what little remained. The Holloway homestead sat on a modest 160 acres, granted under the Homestead Act when she and Samuel had been young enough to believe that hard work alone could conquer the frontier. The cabin Samuel built was solid chinked logs that had weathered 15 Wyoming winters, a stone chimney that drew smoke clean, and windows that faced east to catch the morning light Martha loved. But solid didn't fill an empty root cellar, and sturdy walls couldn't keep hunger from seeping through the cracks. She'd sold the milk cow in November when the first snows came early. December took the chickens, except for the old hen that had stopped laying anyway. January claimed Samuel's pocket watch, the one his father had carried through the war between the states. Each sacrifice had bought her another few weeks, but February had arrived with empty hands and an emptier pantry. Martha walked through the cabin's 3 rooms like a woman counting her blessings and finding the arithmetic wanting. The main room served as kitchen and parlor both, with Samuel's handmade table still bearing the ring stains from countless coffee cups and the knife marks from preparing thousands of meals. Their bedroom remained exactly as it was the morning he died, his boots still by the door, his Sunday hat hanging on the wooden peg he'd whittled smooth. The 3rd room had been meant for children that never came, now serving as storage for the farm implements and household goods she hadn't yet been forced to sell. The morning ritual of feeding the fire had become an exercise in conservation. Each piece of wood represented time, how long before she'd have to venture into the February cold to split more from the dwindling pile. Samuel had cut the autumn before he took ill. She'd grown skilled at nursing small flames into steady warmth, making every log last as long as possible. The mathematics of survival had a way of teaching lessons she'd never wanted to learn. A knock at the door broke through her contemplation. Martha smoothed her graying hair and straightened her shoulders before opening it to find Doc Morrison standing on her porch, his medical bag in one hand and a concerned expression creasing his weathered face. "Morning, Martha Jane," he said, stamping snow from his boots. "Thought I'd check on you, seeing as I was riding out to the Peterson place anyway." "You're welcome to come in, Doc, but I haven't got coffee to offer." The admission stung, but she'd learned that pride was a luxury she could no longer afford. Doc Morrison had been doctoring in Copper Creek for near on 20 years, and his eyes had seen enough hardship to read the signs others missed. He noticed the careful way Martha moved, conserving energy. He saw how her dress hung looser than it should, and how her fingers worried constantly at her wedding ring. "Martha, you know Sarah Chen's been asking after you. Says you haven't been in the general store for weeks." Sarah Chen had arrived in Copper Creek 5 years back with her husband, fleeing troubles in California. When influenza took her husband the second winter, she'd kept the general store running through sheer determination. She understood the peculiar challenges facing a woman alone on the frontier, and she'd extended credit to Martha longer than business sense would normally allow. "I've been managing well enough," Martha replied, though they both knew the truth lived elsewhere. Doc Morrison set down his bag and looked around the cabin with a physician's eye for detail. "You've lost weight, Martha Jane, more than is healthy for a woman your age, especially heading into the hardest part of winter." Martha turned away, busying herself with straightening items that didn't need straightening. "I've been through hard times before, Doc. Samuel and I weathered the grasshopper plague of 74 and the drought of 78. This isn't different. This is different, and you know it." His voice carried the gentle firmness he used when delivering difficult truths. "You were younger then, and you weren't alone." The words settled between them like stones in still water. Martha had spent 3 years avoiding conversations that acknowledged her vulnerability, maintaining the fiction that independence was the same as survival. But standing in her cold cabin, with her empty pantry, the pretense felt as threadbare as her worn dress. "Pastor Williams has been meaning to visit," Doc Morrison continued. "The church has funds set aside for situations like this, good Christian folks looking after their own." "I'm not charity, Doc." The words came out sharper than she intended. "No, you're not. You're a woman who worked alongside her husband to build something meaningful in hard country. You're someone who deserves help when circumstances turn against you." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "But pride won't keep you warm, Martha Jane, and it surely won't fill your belly." After Doc Morrison left, Martha sat at Samuel's table and allowed herself the luxury of honest assessment. The numbers were simple and unforgiving. Without some change in her circumstances, she wouldn't see spring. The realization didn't bring panic. She'd lived too long and survived too much for that. Instead, it brought a curious sense of clarity. She walked to the bedroom and opened the small wooden chest where she kept her most precious belongings. Samuel's letters from their courting days, pressed flowers from their wedding, and at the bottom, wrapped in a piece of blue silk, the silver dollar her father had given her the day she left Illinois to marry Samuel Holloway. "For luck, daughter," he'd said, pressing the coin into her palm. "Save it for when you need it most." She'd carried that coin for over 30 years, through good times and lean, never finding a circumstance that seemed worthy of spending her father's blessing. But as she held it now, feeling its familiar weight and the worn edges that spoke of countless hands and countless hopes, Martha Jane Holloway finally understood what her father had meant. That evening, as the February wind continued its restless song around the cabin, Martha made a decision that would have scandalized the woman she'd been even a month earlier. She would ride into Copper Creek the next night, to Murphy's saloon, and she would risk everything on the turn of a card. The silver dollar caught the firelight as she held it up, and for just a moment she could swear she heard Samuel's voice on the wind, not warning her away from danger, but whispering what he'd always told her when the path ahead seemed impossible. "Sometimes the only way forward is through, Martha Jane. Sometimes the only way through is to be brave enough to begin." She wrapped the coin back in its blue silk and placed it carefully in the pocket of her coat. Tomorrow night, she would discover what kind of woman she'd become in her 58 years, and what kind of future she was brave enough to claim. Murphy's saloon crouched on Copper Creek's main street like a weathered old cat, yellow light spilling from its windows into the February darkness. Martha Jane had walked past this establishment countless times over the years, always with Samuel's steadying presence beside her, and always with a sense of moral distance from whatever transpired within those walls. Tonight, she approached alone, her father's silver dollar burning like a coal in her coat pocket. The saloon's interior assaulted her senses, tobacco smoke thick enough to taste, the sour, sweet smell of whiskey and beer, and underneath it all, the peculiar mixture of leather, sweat, and desperation that seemed to cling to places where men gathered to forget their troubles. The piano player in the corner coaxed a melancholy tune from keys that had seen better decades, while conversations rose and fell in waves around the scattered tables. Martha stood in the doorway longer than she'd intended, her courage faltering as every eye in the place turned toward her. A respectable widow had no business in Murphy's saloon, and the weight of that judgment pressed against her shoulders like a physical thing. She thought of her empty pantry, of Doc Morrison's concerned eyes, of the long winter nights that stretched ahead with nothing but cold and hunger for company. "Well, I'll be damned," said a voice from near the bar. "Martha Jane Holloway, as I live and breathe." The speaker was Jake Murphy himself, a thick-set man with graying whiskers and eyes that had seen enough frontier life to be surprised by very little. He'd known Samuel since the early days, had even done business with him when times were good. Now, he looked at Martha with something between curiosity and concern. "Evening, Jake," Martha said, finding her voice steadier than she'd expected. "I'm looking for a game." The saloon's conversations didn't stop exactly, but they quieted enough that Martha could feel the weight of listening ears. She walked to the bar with her chin raised, refusing to let her desperation show in her bearing. Whatever happened tonight, she would meet it with dignity. "What kind of game you got in mind, Mrs. Holloway?" Jake asked, his tone carefully neutral. "Poker, 5-card draw, nothing fancy." Martha pulled the silver dollar from her pocket and placed it on the bar, the metal ringing against the wood with a sound that seemed to echo in the sudden quiet. Jake looked at the coin, then back at Martha's face. "That's not much of a stake for poker, ma'am. Most of the boys here play for dollars, not dimes." "It's what I have," Martha said simply, "and it's all I need." From a table near the back of the room came a slow chuckle. "Well now, that's a woman with confidence. Mind if we test that theory, ma'am?" The voice belonged to a man Martha had never seen before, tall, even while sitting, with broad shoulders that strained his wool shirt and hands that dwarfed the cards he held. His hair was the color of autumn wheat, and his eyes were blue enough to make her think of summer skies she hadn't seen for months. But it was his voice that caught her attention, gentle despite its deep timbre, with the kind of respect in it that she'd almost forgotten men could offer. "Luke McGraw," he said, touching the brim of his hat in greeting, "and I'd be honored to play cards with a lady brave enough to risk her last dollar on her own skill." The other men at Luke's table, Martha recognized Tom Bradley from the feed store and a couple of ranch hands from the Circle K, looked less certain about including a widow in their game. But Luke McGraw's quiet authority seemed to settle the matter without argument. Martha took the empty chair across from Luke, studying the faces around the table while Jake Murphy dealt the cards. She'd watched Samuel play poker often enough during their courtship to understand the basics, but watching and playing were different creatures entirely. Still, desperation had a way of sharpening a person's focus, and Martha found herself reading the subtle tells that betrayed her opponent's hands, the way Tom Bradley's left eye twitched when he was bluffing, how the younger ranch hand's breathing changed when he held good cards. The first few hands taught her the rhythm of the game and cost her nothing but attention. She folded early and often, learning the men's patterns while preserving her single silver dollar. Luke McGraw played with quiet confidence, winning modest pots without seeming to care much about the money. When he looked at her, his eyes held something she couldn't quite identify, not pity, which she would have resented, but a kind of understanding that made her wonder what sorrows had taught him to recognize desperation in others. "You're playing mighty conservative, Mrs. Holloway," Tom Bradley observed, after she'd folded yet another hand. Can't win if you don't risk anything. Can't lose what you don't risk either, Martha replied, but she knew he was right. Conservative play would preserve her dollar, but wouldn't solve her problems. She needed to win enough to buy food, to last until spring, to prove to herself that she wasn't ready to surrender to circumstances. The hand that changed everything came near midnight. Martha looked at her cards, 2 jacks, a queen, a 7, and a 3, and felt something shift in her chest. Not quite hope, but something cousin to it. She kept her expression neutral while the betting began, matching each raise with careful calculation. Luke McGraw studied her across the table, his blue eyes unreadable. "Going to cost you that silver dollar to stay in, ma'am." Martha pushed her father's coin into the center of the table, where it joined a growing pile of bills and coins that represented more money than she'd seen in months. "I'm staying." The draw came, and Martha discarded the 7 and 3, hoping for another jack or queen. Instead, she found herself holding a 3rd jack and felt her heart hammer against her ribs. 3 jacks was a strong hand, strong enough to win if she played it right. The betting round that followed tested every lesson she'd learned about reading men and hiding her own thoughts. Tom Bradley folded early, muttering about conservative women and unpredictable cards. The ranch hands followed suit, leaving only Martha and Luke McGraw staring at each other across a pot that had grown to nearly $30. "Raise you 5, Luke said quietly, adding another bill to the pile. Martha looked at her cards again, at the 3 jacks that might represent her salvation, and made a decision that would have terrified the woman she'd been a week earlier. "Call." Luke laid down his cards, 2 pair, kings and 8s. A good hand, but not good enough. Martha spread her 3 jacks on the table and reached for the pot with hands that trembled only slightly. "Well played, ma'am," Luke said, and the respect in his voice was genuine. "Took courage to stay in that long with just $1 to your name." Martha gathered the money, marveling at the feel of bills between her fingers. "Thank you, Mr. McGraw. I believe I've done what I came to do." "Actually," Luke said, his voice carrying a note of something that might have been regret, "I'm afraid you've done considerably more than that." Martha looked up from counting her winnings, meeting his eyes across the table. "I don't understand." Luke McGraw straightened in his chair, and Martha noticed for the first time how his clothes, though clean, were worn at the cuffs and knees. "The thing is, Mrs. Holloway, I was playing with borrowed money tonight. Money I don't actually have." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "Where I come from, a man honors his debts, even when he can't pay them in currency." The saloon had grown quiet again, with men leaning forward to hear what came next. Martha felt something cold settle in her stomach that had nothing to do with the winter air seeping through the windows. "What exactly are you saying, Mr. McGraw?" Luke stood slowly, his full height making him tower over the table. "I'm saying that, according to the custom of this country, and my own sense of honor, I owe you a debt I can only pay in service. You've won yourself a cowboy, Mrs. Holloway. The question is, what you plan to do with him." Martha stared up at Luke McGraw, at his weathered face and steady blue eyes, and realized that her gamble had won her far more than money. She'd won herself a problem she'd never imagined, wrapped in the form of a man who looked like he'd stepped out of the stories her father used to tell about the untamed West. Outside, the February wind howled against Murphy's windows, but inside, Martha Jane Holloway sat perfectly still, holding 5 cards that had just changed her life in ways she was only beginning to understand. The ride back to the homestead passed in a silence that felt heavier than the February cold. Luke McGraw sat his horse with the easy grace of a man born to the saddle, keeping a respectful distance behind Martha's wagon while she wrestled with the reality of what had just transpired. The money from her poker winnings was safely tucked in her coat pocket, but the man following her home represented a complication she'd never considered when she'd walked into Murphy's saloon. Martha's mind churned with questions she didn't know how to ask. What did it mean to win a person? How long was he obligated to stay? What would the neighbors think when they saw a strange man working her land? Samuel had been gone 3 years, but the proprieties of widowhood still mattered in a small town like Copper Creek. When they reached the cabin, Luke dismounted and stood beside his horse, waiting for some indication of what was expected. Martha climbed down from her wagon with movements that felt stilted and uncertain, acutely aware that she was about to invite a complete stranger into the home she'd shared with Samuel. "I suppose you'll need somewhere to sleep," she said finally, her breath forming clouds in the frigid air. "The barn would suit me fine, ma'am," Luke replied. "I've slept in worse places, and I wouldn't want to impose on your household arrangements." Martha felt a flutter of relief at his thoughtfulness, followed immediately by a stab of guilt. No matter what circumstances had brought him here, Luke McGraw was a human being, and the barn was no place for anyone in February weather. "The barn's not fit for man nor beast in this cold," she said. "There's a room in the cabin that's not being used. You're welcome to it, provided we understand each other about the proprieties of the situation." Luke touched the brim of his hat. "You have my word as a gentleman, Mrs. Holloway. I'll conduct myself with complete respect for your home and your reputation." Martha studied his face in the moonlight, looking for signs of insincerity or hidden intentions. She'd lived 58 years and had developed a fair sense for reading character. But Luke McGraw remained largely unreadable. His manner was respectful without being obsequious, and his eyes held a steadiness that suggested a man accustomed to keeping his word. "All right then," she said. "Let's get your horse settled and figure out sleeping arrangements." The morning brought an awkwardness that neither of them had quite anticipated. Martha woke before dawn, as had been her habit for decades, and dressed quietly in her bedroom, while trying not to think about the man sleeping in what had once been meant as a nursery. She made coffee and biscuits with some of the supplies she'd been able to purchase with her winnings, the familiar routine providing comfort in an otherwise uncertain situation. Luke appeared in the kitchen doorway as she was setting the table, his hair damp from washing and his clothes neat, despite their obvious wear. He'd made an effort to clean up, and Martha appreciated the courtesy. "Morning, Mrs. Holloway," he said. "I hope I'm not intruding on your breakfast preparations." "Not at all. I always make more than I can eat anyway." The lie came easily. She'd grown accustomed to cooking for one, but something about Luke's presence made her want to maintain the fiction of normalcy. They sat at Samuel's table in a silence that felt charged with unspoken questions. Martha poured coffee and tried not to notice how Luke's large hands dwarfed the cup, or how he ate with the careful manners of a man who'd been taught proper behavior, but had spent considerable time in places where such niceties were luxuries. "I should probably explain my situation," Luke said finally, setting down his cup with deliberate care. "I know last night must have seemed mighty strange, and you deserve to understand what you've gotten yourself into." Martha nodded, grateful that he was willing to address the elephant in the room. "I'd appreciate that, Mr. McGraw. I've been working ranches through Colorado and Wyoming for the better part of 15 years, Luke began. "Good work, honest work, but the kind that doesn't leave a man with much to show for his efforts beyond calloused hands and a clear conscience." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "I had some money saved up, enough to maybe buy a small spread of my own, but I made some poor choices in Denver last month." "Gambling?" Martha asked. "Among other things." Luke's voice carried a note of regret that seemed genuine. "I lost more than I could afford to lose, and I've been working to pay off debts ever since. The money I was playing with last night belonged to a man in Cheyenne who's not known for his patience with debtors." Martha felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. "Are you saying we might expect unwelcome visitors?" "No, ma'am. I sent word to Cheyenne this morning, explaining the situation. The debt's been transferred to you, along with my obligation to work it off. That's the way these things are handled in this part of the country." Martha absorbed this information while studying Luke's face. His explanation raised as many questions as it answered, but his willingness to be forthright about his circumstances suggested a man with at least some sense of honor. "How long?" she asked. 6 months, maybe 8, depending on how we calculate the value of the work. I'm good with horses, decent with cattle, and I can fix most things that break around a homestead. I'll earn my keep and then some." Martha rose from the table and walked to the window, looking out at the snow-covered yard where Samuel had spent so many mornings planning the day's work. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd risked everything to win enough money to survive the winter, and instead, she'd won a man whose presence might solve problems she hadn't even known how to address. "I should probably tell you," she said without turning around, "this place isn't exactly a going concern. The livestock's been sold off, and I've been struggling just to keep body and soul together. If you're expecting wages beyond room and board, you're going to be disappointed. Room and board's more than fair, ma'am. I'm not looking to profit from your situation." Martha turned back to face him, noting the way he sat perfectly still in his chair, his worn work gloves resting on the table beside his coffee cup. Those gloves told a story of their own leather, soft with use, fingers reinforced with careful stitching, palms darkened by years of honest labor. They were the hands of a man who understood the value of hard work, and Martha found herself trusting them more than his words. "All right, Mr. McGraw," she said. "I suppose we'll see how this arrangement works out. But I want you to understand something from the start. I've been managing on my own for 3 years, and I don't need anyone feeling sorry for me or treating me like I'm helpless." Luke stood and picked up his gloves, sliding them onto his hands with practiced efficiency. "Yes, ma'am. I wouldn't dream of it." He paused at the door, hat in hand. "If you don't mind me asking, what would you like me to start with today?" Martha looked around the kitchen, thinking of all the tasks that had been accumulating during the long winter months. The fence along the north pasture's been down since the November storm, and the roof's got a leak over the back room that I haven't been able to reach. "I'll take a look at both," Luke said. "Anything else? That'll be plenty for now." Martha watched him settle his hat on his head and head for the door. "Mr. McGraw?" "Yes, ma'am. Thank you. For being straightforward about things, I mean. And for Tay." She paused, not quite sure how to finish the thought. "You don't need to thank me, Mrs. Holloway. We both ended up in circumstances we didn't plan for. Might as well make the best of it." After he'd gone outside, Martha cleared the breakfast dishes and tried to make sense of how dramatically her life had changed in the space of 12 hours. Yesterday morning she'd been a desperate widow with no prospects beyond starvation or charity. Today she was a woman with money in her pocket and a strong man working in her yard. She couldn't decide if that represented salvation or simply a more complicated form of trouble. 3 weeks into March, Martha began to understand that Luke McGraw was not quite the man she'd initially taken him for. The fence repairs had been completed with a precision that spoke of military training, each post set at exactly the right depth, and every wire drawn taut as a violin string. The roof repair had eliminated not just the leak she'd mentioned, but 2 others she hadn't even noticed. More telling still were the small improvements he made without being asked: the squeaky hinge on the barn door that now swung silent, the loose board on the front steps that no longer shifted underfoot. But it was the evenings that surprised her most. After supper, when the day's work was done, and the cabin had settled into the familiar rhythms of evening quiet, Luke would sit on the front porch despite the lingering cold and sing in a voice that seemed to carry the loneliness of every cowboy who'd ever watched stars from a bedroll on the open range. His songs weren't the rowdy saloon tunes she might have expected, but older melodies, ballads about lost loves and distant homes, spirituals that spoke of hope deferred but not abandoned. Martha found herself lingering over the evening dishes, listening through the open window to lyrics that stirred emotions she'd thought safely buried with Samuel. There was something in Luke's voice that spoke of a man who understood loss, who had learned to find beauty in sorrow without being consumed by it. "That's a pretty song," she said one evening, stepping onto the porch with 2 cups of coffee. "I don't think I've heard it before." Luke looked up from the small piece of wood he'd been carving, his knife stilling in his hands. "My mother used to sing it when I was small. Something about a mockingbird and promises that couldn't be kept." He accepted the coffee with a nod of thanks. I probably don't remember all the words right, but the melody stays true. Martha settled into the chair beside him, noticing for the first time the delicate bird taking shape under his knife. The carving was beautiful, a tiny wren with its head tilted, as if listening for some distant song. "You're quite skilled with that knife." "Helps pass the time," Luke said, his attention returning to the careful work of shaping feathers into the soft wood. "A man gets into the habit of keeping his hands busy during the quiet hours. May I ask where you learned to carve like that?" Luke's hands paused for just a moment before resuming their steady work. "Army taught me a lot of things. How to fix what's broken, how to make do with what you have, how to find peace in small tasks when the world gets too large to manage." It was the first direct reference he'd made to military service, and Martha felt a door opening to understanding this complex man who'd landed so unexpectedly in her life. "You were a soldier? Cavalry? 15 years. From the time I was barely old enough to lie about my age, until I decided I'd had enough of taking orders that didn't sit right with my conscience." Luke held up the carving to catch the last of the daylight. "Some experiences change a man in ways that don't wash off with soap and water." Martha studied his profile in the gathering dusk, noting the way his jaw tightened slightly when he spoke of his military past. "Is that why you left? Conscience troubles?" "Among other reasons." Luke set down his knife and looked out across the darkening prairie. "There comes a time when a man has to decide what kind of person he wants to be, regardless of what his superiors might prefer. I made my choice and left to live with the consequences." The weight of unspoken history hung between them like smoke from a distant fire. Martha sensed that Luke's story contained chapters he wasn't ready to share, and she respected his right to privacy. After 3 years of widowhood, she understood that some sorrows were too personal for casual conversation. "Well," she said finally, "whatever brought you here, I'm grateful for the work you've done. The place hasn't looked this good since Samuel took sick." "Your husband was a good man," Luke said quietly. "I can see his care in every board and nail of this homestead. A place built with that much love deserves to be maintained properly." Martha felt tears prick her eyes at the unexpected tribute. Most people in Copper Creek had moved past acknowledging Samuel's memory, assuming that 3 years was sufficient time for grief to run its course. Luke's recognition of her husband's legacy touched something deep in her chest that she'd thought had healed over. "He was," she said simply, "he was a good man." They sat in comfortable silence as full darkness settled over the homestead. Martha found herself acutely aware of Luke's presence beside her, the way he breathed slowly and deeply, as if consciously savoring the evening air. The careful way he handled the small carving, the unconscious dignity in his posture, even while relaxing. "Mrs. Holloway," Luke said eventually, "I hope you don't mind me asking, but do you ever get lonely out here? It's a lot of space for one person to manage, both practically and otherwise." The question caught Martha off guard with its directness and unexpected gentleness. She'd grown so accustomed to deflecting inquiries about her well-being that she'd almost forgotten what honest concern sounded like. "Some," she admitted, "more than I care to think about most days. Samuel and I, we were good companions. We could work all day without saying much, but knowing the other was there made everything easier somehow." "I imagine it did." Luke's voice carried a note of understanding that suggested personal experience with solitude. "Companionship's one of those things you don't fully appreciate until it's gone." Martha glanced at him, wondering what losses had taught him that particular truth. "Have you been married, Mr. McGraw?" "No, ma'am. Came close once, but military life doesn't lend itself well to building the kind of partnership you had with your husband. I've spent most of my adult years either taking orders or working alone. That sounds like a lonely way to live." Luke smiled, the expression transforming his weathered features in ways that made Martha suddenly aware of how handsome he must have been as a younger man. "It can be, but it also teaches a man to appreciate good company when he finds it." The comment hung in the air between them, carrying implications that neither was quite ready to address directly. Martha felt a flutter of something that might have been attraction, followed immediately by a surge of guilt that made her grip her coffee cup more tightly. "I should probably head inside," she said, rising from her chair with movements that felt unnecessarily abrupt. "Morning comes early. Of course. Thank you for the coffee, Mrs. Holloway, and for the company." Martha paused at the door, looking back at Luke's silhouette against the star-filled sky. "Good night, Mr. McGraw." "Good night, Ma'am." Inside the cabin, Martha prepared for bed, with her mind churning over the evening's conversation. Luke McGraw was proving to be a far more complex individual than she'd anticipated, a man with evident education and refinement despite his rough circumstances, someone who understood both hard work and the subtle courtesies that made difficult situations bearable. As she brushed her hair before the bedroom mirror, Martha caught sight of Samuel's wedding ring on her finger and felt a familiar pang of conflicted emotion. She'd worn that ring for 3 years as a symbol of continuing devotion, but lately she'd begun to wonder if honoring Samuel's memory required her to remain forever frozen in widowhood. Outside, she could hear Luke's voice, raised in another soft ballad, the melody carrying through the thin walls and settling around her like a gentle embrace. For the first time since Samuel's death, Martha Jane Holloway fell asleep to the sound of a man's voice and discovered that loneliness was a burden that felt lighter when shared. The trouble arrived on a Tuesday morning in early April, dressed in a fine wool coat and riding a horse that cost more than most men earned in a year. Martha was hanging laundry on the line behind the cabin when she heard the approaching hoofbeats, and something in the rhythm, too measured, too purposeful, made her stomach tighten with apprehension. Thomas Holloway dismounted with the careful precision of a man who wanted to make an impression. Samuel's younger brother had always carried himself with the bearing of someone who believed his opinions mattered more than most, and the intervening years since Samuel's funeral had done nothing to diminish his sense of self-importance. He wore his prosperity like armor, from his carefully waxed mustache to his polished boots, and Martha had never been entirely comfortable in his presence. "Martha Jane," he said, removing his hat with a flourish that seemed calculated to demonstrate his superior breeding. "You're looking well." Martha wiped her hands on her apron and forced herself to meet his gaze directly. "Thomas, this is unexpected. I didn't know you were planning a visit to Wyoming." "Business brings me through the territory," Thomas replied, his eyes already scanning the homestead with the assessing gaze of a man who measured everything in terms of profit and loss. "I thought it was time we had a conversation about your situation here." The words carried an undercurrent of authority that set Martha's teeth on edge. Thomas had always possessed the peculiar ability to make reasonable requests sound like veiled threats, and she'd learned to be wary when he adopted that particular tone. "My situation is perfectly fine, thank you," Martha said, turning back to the laundry basket with movements designed to project calm indifference. "Is it?" Thomas stepped closer, and Martha could smell the pomade he used to keep his thinning hair in place. "Because from what I've been hearing in town, you've got a strange man living in my brother's house, working land that may not even be legally yours to manage." Martha's hands stilled on the wet sheet she'd been preparing to hang. "What exactly are you suggesting, Thomas?" "I'm suggesting that a woman alone is vulnerable to all manner of poor decisions and unfortunate circumstances." Thomas pulled a folded document from his coat pocket. "I've been consulting with attorneys in Denver about Samuel's estate, and there are some irregularities that need to be addressed." Martha felt ice form in her veins despite the warming spring air. "Samuel left everything to me. We had it all legally documented when he took sick." "Yes, but there are questions about the original homestead claim. Seems my brother may have made some errors in the filing process that could invalidate your current ownership." Thomas unfolded the papers with deliberate ceremony. "These documents suggest that the land rightfully belongs to Samuel's heir, which would be me, as his only surviving blood relative." Martha snatched the papers from his hands, her eyes scanning the dense legal language that seemed designed to confuse rather than clarify. She caught enough phrases: improper documentation, invalid claim, rightful inheritance, to understand that Thomas was threatening everything she'd fought to preserve. "This is nonsense," she said, though her voice carried less conviction than she would have liked. "Samuel and I worked this land together for over 20 years. I have as much right to it as anyone. Morally, perhaps. Legally is another matter entirely." Thomas retrieved the documents and refolded them with maddening precision. "But I'm not an unreasonable man, Martha Jane. I'm prepared to offer you a fair price for whatever improvements you and Samuel made to the property, enough to set you up comfortably in town, maybe even with a little left over for your old age." Martha felt rage building in her chest like steam in a kettle. The casual way Thomas dismissed her life's work, the condescending assumption that she should be grateful for his charity, the fundamental insult of treating her like a tenant on land she'd helped tame from raw prairie, it all combined into an anger that made her hands shake. "And if I refuse your generous offer?" she asked. Thomas smiled, the expression never reaching his eyes. "Then I'm afraid you'll find yourself fighting a legal battle you can't afford to win. Courts tend to favor documented claims over sentimental attachments, and I have resources you simply don't possess." It was at that moment that Luke appeared around the corner of the cabin, his presence so sudden and quiet that Thomas actually stepped backward in surprise. Martha had been so focused on her brother-in-law's threats that she hadn't heard Luke approaching, but now she was grateful for his timing. "Ma'am," Luke said, touching his hat brim in greeting, "didn't mean to interrupt, but I wanted to ask about those fence posts for the south pasture." Martha seized the opportunity to compose herself, using the mundane question as a shield against Thomas's scrutiny. "The posts can wait, Mr. McGraw. I'd like you to meet my brother-in-law, Thomas Holloway. Thomas, this is Luke McGraw, who's been helping with the spring work." Luke stepped forward and extended his hand, his manner perfectly respectful, but carrying an undertone of quiet authority that made Thomas hesitate before accepting the greeting. "Pleasure to meet you, Mr. Holloway. Your brother built a fine homestead here. You must be proud of what he accomplished." Thomas shook Luke's hand briefly, his expression suggesting he was reassessing the situation in light of this new information. Luke stood nearly a head taller than Thomas, and his weathered hands made Thomas's soft fingers look pale and ineffectual by comparison. "Yes, well, Samuel always was ambitious," Thomas said, his voice carrying a note of dismissal, "though I'm afraid ambition doesn't always translate to legal clarity." Luke's expression didn't change, but Martha noticed how his stance shifted slightly, becoming more alert without appearing threatening. Legal clarity can be a tricky thing in frontier territory. Sometimes a man's word and his work count for more than paperwork, especially when the community knows his character. "Perhaps," Thomas replied, but his confidence seemed to have diminished somewhat. Unfortunately, courts require more than community sentiment to settle property disputes. Martha watched the subtle tension between the two men and felt a surge of gratitude for Luke's understated support. He wasn't challenging Thomas directly, but his presence alone seemed to shift the balance of the conversation in ways that made her feel less vulnerable. "Thomas was just explaining some concerns about the homestead documentation," Martha said, her voice steadier now that she wasn't facing the threat alone. "Apparently there are questions about the original filing." Luke nodded thoughtfully. "Those early homestead claims can be complicated. Good thing there are people in Copper Creek who remember when your husband first staked this land. Doc Morrison, for instance, and Jake Murphy, men whose testimony would carry weight in any legal proceeding." Thomas's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Witness testimony is all well and good, but documentation remains the foundation of any legitimate claim. "True enough," Luke agreed. "Of course, there's also the matter of improvements and continuous occupation. Courts tend to look favorably on folks who've invested their lives in developing property, especially when they've got community support and a clear record of good stewardship." Martha watched Thomas realize that what he'd intended as a simple intimidation had become something more complex. Luke's quiet expertise in legal matters suggested education and experience that Thomas hadn't anticipated. And the respectful way Luke spoke about the homestead made it clear that any challenge to Martha's ownership would have to account for her defender's knowledge and determination. "Well," Thomas said finally, returning his hat to his head with sharp movements that betrayed his frustration, "I suppose we'll let the attorneys sort through the details. Martha Jane, I trust you'll give serious consideration to my offer. These legal matters can become quite expensive and emotionally taxing." "I'll consider everything carefully," Martha replied, her voice carrying more steel than it had at the beginning of their conversation. After Thomas rode away, Martha and Luke stood in the yard, watching his retreating figure until he disappeared over the ridge. Martha felt drained by the encounter, but also strangely energized by the way Luke had handled himself. "Thank you," she said finally, "for what you did back there." Luke shrugged, his attention already turning to practical matters. "Man like that counts on folks being isolated and intimidated. Sometimes, just having witnesses changes the mathematics of a situation." Martha looked at the legal papers still clutched in her hand, their official language seeming less threatening now that she'd seen Thomas retreat. "Do you really think community testimony would matter in court?" "More than you might expect," Luke said. "But it might not come to that. Men like your brother-in-law usually prefer easy victories to actual fights. Make it clear you're not backing down, and he might look for softer targets." Martha folded the papers and tucked them into her apron pocket, symbolically refusing to let them dominate her thoughts. "I hope you're right, Mr. McGraw. I surely hope you're right." That evening, Martha sat at Samuel's table with her husband's worn Bible open before her, seeking comfort in familiar passages while her mind churned over Thomas's threats. Between the pages, pressed like a flower between sheets of tissue paper, lay the prairie rose Samuel had picked for her on their wedding day, dried now to the color of old parchment, but still holding its shape after all these years. She touched the fragile petals with one finger, remembering how Samuel had insisted on stopping their wedding procession to gather the flower from a wild patch beside the church. "Something beautiful should mark something beautiful," he'd said, tucking the rose behind her ear, despite her protests that it wasn't proper. Now the rose seemed to mock her confusion. How could she honor Samuel's memory while allowing herself to feel drawn to another man? How could she claim to love her late husband while finding comfort in Luke's presence, strength in his support, and something that felt dangerously close to happiness in their evening conversations? Luke's soft knock at the door interrupted her brooding. "Mrs. Holloway, I wanted to discuss something about your brother-in-law's visit, if you have a moment." Martha closed the Bible carefully, keeping the rose safely pressed between its pages. "Come in, Mr. McGraw. I was hoping we could talk about that myself." Luke entered with his hat in his hands, his expression more serious than she'd seen since his arrival. "I've been thinking about those legal documents he showed you. There might be more to this situation than what appeared on the surface." Martha gestured for him to sit, then poured coffee from the pot that had been keeping warm on the stove. "What do you mean?" "Men like Thomas Holloway don't typically travel hundreds of miles to threaten widows over property disputes, unless there's something more valuable at stake than a small homestead." Luke accepted the coffee. Gratefully. "Has anything changed recently that might make this land more attractive to outside interests?" Martha considered the question while studying Luke's face. The lamplight cast shadows that emphasized the weathered lines around his eyes, evidence of years spent squinting into sun and weather. There was something reassuring about those lines. They spoke of a man who'd lived fully and learned from experience. "Not that I know of," she said finally. "Samuel always said this was good grazing land, but nothing special enough to fight over." "What about water rights, mining prospects, railroad development?" "Water rights go with the land, same as always. I've never heard talk of mining, and the railroad's still 20 miles south." Martha paused, struck by a sudden thought. "Though now that you mention it, there was a surveyor through here last fall. Said he was mapping for the territorial government, but he spent an awful lot of time asking questions about property boundaries." Luke leaned forward, his attention sharpening. "What kind of questions?" Who owned what, how long they'd been here, whether the claims were properly documented. At the time, I figured it was just routine government business. Martha felt a chill of understanding. You think Thomas might know something I don't? It's possible. Men with his kind of resources don't usually make moves without inside information. Luke set down his coffee cup with deliberate care. Mrs. Holloway, I need to tell you something about my own circumstances that might affect how we handle this situation. Martha braced herself, recognizing the tone of a man preparing to share difficult truths. Go ahead. I wasn't entirely forthcoming about why I left the army. The truth is, I was facing court-martial proceedings when I resigned my commission. Luke's voice remained steady, but Martha could see the cost of this admission in the tightness around his eyes. I refused a direct order to relocate a peaceful Cheyenne village to make way for railroad development. The order would have meant forcing families from land they'd occupied legally under treaty agreements. Martha absorbed this information, understanding now why Luke had spoken with such knowledge about property rights and legal documentation. What happened? I was given 24 hours to reconsider my position. Instead, I submitted my resignation and left before the court-martial could proceed. Luke met her gaze directly. Technically, that makes me a deserter in the eyes of military law. And you think Thomas might discover this somehow? It's possible. Men with political connections sometimes have access to military records. If he's looking for ways to discredit me or undermine your position, my past could provide ammunition. Martha felt a surge of protectiveness that surprised her with its intensity. Let him try. Any man who'd stand up for what's right against his own superiors is exactly the kind of person I'd want on my side. Luke's expression softened at her fierce declaration. You might not feel that way if my presence here brings you additional trouble. Mr. McGraw-Luke. Martha paused, realizing she'd used his given name without conscious thought. You've shown me nothing but honor and respect since you've been here. Whatever mistakes you think you've made in the past, I've seen the man you are now, and I trust that man completely. The silence that followed carried weight beyond words. Martha felt as though she'd crossed some invisible line, moving from the careful politeness of their arrangement into something more personal and potentially dangerous. There's something else, Luke said quietly. About the way I feel. He stopped, seeming to wrestle with words that wouldn't come easily. Martha's heart began beating faster, though she wasn't sure if it was from hope or fear. Luke, I care about what happens to you, Martha. More than I should, considering our circumstances. More than is probably wise for either of us. Luke stood and walked to the window, looking out into the darkness. I know it's not my place to say such things, and I know you're still grieving your husband, but I wanted you to understand that my stake in protecting this place goes beyond any debt I might owe. Martha rose from her chair on unsteady legs, her mind reeling from the admission she'd been both hoping for and dreading. Luke, You don't need to say anything, he said quickly, turning back to face her. I just wanted you to know that whatever comes with your brother-in-law or anyone else, you won't face it alone, not as long as I have anything to say about it. Martha looked at this man, who'd arrived in her life through the strangest of circumstances and somehow become essential to her happiness. His presence had awakened feelings she'd thought were buried forever with Samuel, and the guilt of that awakening warred with a growing recognition that her heart was capable of loving more than once. Samuel's been gone 3 years, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Sometimes I feel like I've been holding my breath that whole time, waiting for permission to start living again. Luke took a step closer, his eyes searching her face. And now? Now I think maybe I've been waiting for the right reason to start breathing again. Martha reached for the Bible on the table, opening it to the page where the prairie rose lay, pressed between tissue paper. Samuel gave me this on our wedding day. I've kept it all these years as a reminder of the love we shared. Luke looked at the delicate flower, understanding the significance of what she was showing him. It's beautiful. It is, and it's also finished a perfect thing from a perfect time that's complete in itself. Martha closed the Bible gently. But Samuel also used to say that every season has its purpose, and that a person who refuses to plant new seeds because they're afraid of dishonoring old harvests will end up with nothing but empty fields. Luke stepped closer still, close enough that Martha could see the hope beginning to kindle in his eyes. "What are you saying, Martha?" "I'm saying that I care about you too, Luke McGraw, more than I thought possible, and more than I know what to do with." Martha felt tears threatening but refused to let them fall. "I'm saying that when Thomas threatened to take this place away, what frightened me most wasn't losing the land, it was losing the life I've started to build here with you." Luke reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she chose, and gently took her hand in his weathered fingers. "Then we'll make sure that doesn't happen. Whatever it takes, whatever we have to fight, we'll face it together." Martha looked down at their joined hands, her pale fingers intertwined with his sun-darkened ones, and felt something shift inside her chest. Not the desperate gratitude of a woman accepting charity, but the quiet strength of a woman choosing her own path forward. "Together," she agreed, and for the first time since Samuel's death, the word carried the promise of happiness rather than mere survival. The riders appeared on the eastern horizon 3 days after Martha and Luke's evening conversation, their military bearing visible even at a distance. Martha was hanging wash on the line when she spotted them, and something in the precise formation of their approach made her stomach clench with foreboding. She called for Luke, who emerged from the barn with a bucket of grain in his hands and an expression that shifted from curiosity to grim recognition as he followed her gaze. "How many?" he asked quietly, setting down the bucket with deliberate care. "4, maybe 5. Martha shaded her eyes against the morning sun. "Are they coming for you?" Luke's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Appears so. I'd hoped I had more time before the army caught up with my trail." Martha felt something fierce and protective rise in her chest. "What do? We tell the truth and see what happens." Luke's voice carried a calm that Martha suspected cost him considerable effort. "But Martha, you need to understand that my presence here might complicate your situation with Thomas even more than we'd anticipated." The soldiers drew closer, their blue uniforms and polished brass catching the morning light. The officer in the lead sat his horse, with the bearing of a man accustomed to command, his weathered face set in lines that suggested he'd dealt with difficult situations before. When they reached the yard, he dismounted with military precision and approached the porch where Martha and Luke stood, waiting. "Ma'am," the officer said, touching his hat brim respectfully. "Captain James Morrison, United States Cavalry. I'm looking for a man named Luke McGraw." Martha felt Luke step slightly forward, positioning himself between her and the soldiers. "I'm McGraw." Captain Morrison studied Luke with the assessing gaze of a career soldier. "Former Captain Lucas McGraw, late of the 3rd Cavalry Regiment?" "That's correct." "Sir, you're under arrest for desertion and conduct unbecoming an officer. You'll need to come with us for transport to Fort Collins, where you'll await court-martial proceedings." Martha watched this exchange with growing alarm, but it was the expression on Captain Morrison's face that truly worried her. There was something beyond duty in his manner, a personal quality that suggested this was more than routine military justice. "Captain," Luke said, his voice remaining steady despite the circumstances, "might I ask who issued the order for my arrest?" "The order comes from Colonel Harrison Webb, with the authority of the Department of the Platte." Captain Morrison paused, seeming to weigh his next words carefully. "The Colonel has taken a particular interest in your case, especially given recent developments regarding your activities since leaving the service." Luke's posture shifted almost imperceptibly, a subtle stiffening that Martha recognized as the reaction of a man receiving unwelcome news. "What activities would those be, Captain?" "It seems you've been involving yourself in civilian legal matters that touch on military interests. Specifically, property disputes involving land designated for potential railroad development." Captain Morrison's tone remained professional, but Martha caught an undercurrent of something that might have been sympathy. The Colonel believes your knowledge of certain classified information makes your current circumstances problematic. Martha felt the pieces of a larger puzzle beginning to fall into place. Classified information? Captain Morrison glanced at her, then back at Luke. Ma'am, your employee here was the intelligence officer responsible for surveying this entire region for potential strategic and commercial development. His knowledge of mineral deposits, water rights, and transportation corridors makes him valuable to interests that may not align with current military policy. Luke's expression had gone carefully blank, the look of a man who'd just realized how thoroughly he'd been outmaneuvered. And I suppose Thomas Holloway has made the army aware of my presence here? Mr. Holloway has been quite cooperative in providing information about your whereabouts and activities, Captain Morrison confirmed. He's expressed concern that you might be using classified knowledge to interfere with legitimate business development in the territory. Martha felt rage building in her chest like steam in a kettle. Thomas hadn't just threatened her property. He'd somehow managed to turn Luke's military service against him, using it as leverage to remove the one person capable of defending her interests. That's absurd, she said, stepping forward despite Luke's subtle attempt to keep her behind him. Mr. McGraw has done nothing but honest work on my homestead. He's never mentioned anything about minerals or railroads or any other development. Captain Morrison's expression softened slightly. Ma'am, I don't doubt Mr. McGraw's conduct, while in your employ, has been exemplary. But the fact remains that he possesses knowledge that certain parties consider valuable, and his current legal status makes him vulnerable to pressure from interests that may not have the Army's best concerns in mind. Luke spoke up, his voice carrying a note of bitter understanding. Let me guess, Colonel Webb is concerned that I might sell information to railroad speculators or mining interests. Or perhaps he's worried I might use what I know to help local property owners resist development they don't want. Something like that, Captain Morrison agreed reluctantly. Martha looked from Luke to the captain, beginning to understand the real scope of what they were facing. You're saying that Luke's knowledge makes him dangerous to people who want to acquire land in this area. I'm saying that former officers with sensitive information become pawns in larger games, ma'am. And pawns are most useful when they're under someone's direct control. Luke was quiet for a long moment, his gaze focused on something beyond the immediate situation. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of a man who'd just understood how completely he'd been manipulated. The surveyor who came through here last fall, he said to Martha. Did he spend much time talking to you about the homestead's boundaries and documentation? Yes, he did. He seemed particularly interested in. Martha stopped, her eyes widening as understanding dawned. He was gathering information for Thomas. More than that, Luke said grimly. He was probably confirming what I already knew about this area from my military surveys. This land sits on one of the richest aquifers in the territory, and there's a coal seam running underneath it that would be worth a fortune to the right mining company. Captain Morrison nodded reluctantly. Your homestead, ma'am, is located on property that several powerful interests consider essential to their development plans. Mr. McGraw's knowledge of its true value makes him either a valuable ally or a dangerous enemy, depending on which side controls him. Martha felt the ground shifting beneath her feet as she realized the full extent of what they were facing. This wasn't just about Thomas wanting family property, or even about Luke's desertion charges. This was about powerful men who saw her land as a commodity, and Luke as either a tool or an obstacle to their plans. So what happens now? She asked. Captain Morrison looked genuinely regretful. Now I have to take Mr. McGraw back to Fort Collins, where he'll await trial. The charges are serious enough that he could face years in military prison if convicted. And if he cooperates with Colonel Webb's investigation? Martha asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. If he provides information about potential development opportunities in this region and testifies in support of certain land acquisition proceedings, the charges might be reduced significantly. Captain Morrison's tone made it clear he understood the moral implications of what he was describing. Luke straightened to his full height, every inch the military officer he'd once been. "And if I refuse to cooperate? Then you'll serve your full sentence, and Mrs. Holloway will face her legal challenges without the benefit of your knowledge or support." Martha watched Luke process this information, seeing him calculate the cost of resistance against the price of compliance. She understood now why Thomas had been so confident in his threats. He'd arranged for Luke to be removed just when she needed his help most, while simultaneously offering Luke a way out that would require him to betray her interests. "There's something else," Captain Morrison said reluctantly. "Colonel Webb has made it clear that your continued association with Mrs. Holloway could be seen as evidence of conspiracy to defraud the government of valuable mineral rights. If you remain here, she could face federal charges as well." The trap was perfect in its cruelty. Luke could save himself by abandoning Martha, or he could stay and condemn them both. Either way, the powerful interests behind Thomas's machinations would get what they wanted, clear access to land they considered rightfully theirs. Luke looked at Martha, his blue eyes holding depths of regret and determination that made her heart ache. "Captain Morrison, I need a moment to speak with Mrs. Holloway privately." "Of course, but I'm afraid I can't give you long." Luke took Martha's hand and led her a few steps away from the soldiers, his voice dropping to a whisper that only she could hear. "Martha, listen to me carefully. In the root cellar, behind the preserves, there's a loose board. Behind that board is a pouch containing my military survey notes for this entire region. Those notes document every mineral deposit, every water source, every piece of valuable land from here to Cheyenne." Martha's eyes widened. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because those notes are the only thing that gives you real power in this situation. Thomas and his associates want this land because they know what's under it, but they don't have detailed documentation of exactly where the valuable deposits are located. Without my notes, they'll have to spend years and thousands of dollars surveying everything themselves." "Luke, what are you planning?" "I'm going to go with Captain Morrison and face whatever charges they bring. But I'm not going to cooperate with Webb's investigation, and I'm not going to testify against you." Luke's grip on her hand tightened. "Those notes are your insurance policy, Martha. Use them wisely, and you might be able to turn this whole situation to your advantage." Martha felt tears threatening but refused to let them fall. There has to be another way. Maybe there is. But right now, the most important thing is keeping you safe and making sure you have the tools you need to fight for what's yours. Luke lifted her hand to his lips and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "I'll find a way back to you, Martha Jane. That's a promise." As Luke walked back toward the waiting soldiers, Martha realized that the faded military commission hidden in his belongings wasn't just evidence of his past. It was the key to understanding a conspiracy that threatened everything she'd built. And now, with Luke being taken away to face uncertain justice, she would have to learn how to use that knowledge to save them both. The silence that followed the soldiers' departure felt like a physical weight pressing down on the homestead. Martha stood in her empty yard, watching the dust cloud of their passage fade into the distance, and tried to process the magnitude of what had just been revealed. Luke was gone, possibly forever, and she was left to face Thomas's conspiracy with nothing but her own determination and whatever Luke had hidden in the root cellar. She waited until evening before retrieving Luke's survey notes, partly from caution and partly because she needed time to gather her courage for what she might find. The root cellar was dark and cool, smelling of earth and the last of her winter preserves. Behind the mason jars, just as Luke had described, she found the loose board and the leather pouch hidden behind it. The documents inside were unlike anything she'd ever seen, detailed maps covered with precise measurements, geological symbols, and notations in Luke's careful handwriting. Even without technical training, Martha could see that these surveys documented something extraordinary. Her modest homestead sat at the center of what Luke had identified as a significant coal deposit. while the underground water system that fed her well was part of a massive aquifer that could supply development for hundreds of miles. Martha spread the maps on her kitchen table and studied them by lamplight, beginning to understand why Thomas had been so confident in his threats. These weren't just valuable properties, they were the foundation for an industrial empire that could transform the entire territory. The railroad interests, the mining companies, even the territorial government itself would pay enormous sums for this information. But as she studied Luke's careful notations, Martha also began to see possibilities that Thomas and his associates might not have considered. The coal deposits were valuable, certainly, but they were also complex. Some areas were easily accessible, while others would require expensive and dangerous excavation. The water rights were extensive, but they came with obligations to existing settlers and established claims that couldn't be simply swept aside. Luke hadn't just documented the wealth beneath her land, he'd also documented the legal and practical challenges that would face anyone trying to exploit it without proper agreements with existing property owners. A knock at the door interrupted her study. Martha quickly rolled up the maps and tucked them into the Bible with Samuel's Prairie rose before answering. Doc Morrison stood on her porch, his medical bag in hand, and a concerned expression on his weathered face. "Evening, Martha Jane. I heard about the soldiers taking Luke away this morning. Thought I'd check on how you're managing." Martha felt a surge of gratitude for Doc Morrison's kindness. In a community where gossip traveled faster than wildfire, his continued support meant more than he probably realized. "Come in, Doc. I've got coffee on the stove." Doc Morrison settled into his usual chair at the kitchen table, his observant eyes taking note of Martha's drawn expression and the subtle signs of stress she couldn't quite hide. "You want to tell me what really happened today? Because the story making rounds in town doesn't sound like the whole truth." Martha poured coffee and considered how much to reveal. Doc Morrison had known her and Samuel for years, and his discretion was absolute. But the knowledge Luke had entrusted to her carried dangers that could extend to anyone who shared it. "Luke was arrested on desertion charges," she said finally. "Apparently his military past caught up with him. And you believe that's all there is to it?" Martha met his gaze directly. "I believe there are people who want Luke removed from the picture for reasons that have nothing to do with military justice." Doc Morrison nodded slowly. "Thomas Holloway's been making inquiries around town about property values and development prospects, asking questions about who's been here longest, who has the strongest claims, who might be vulnerable to pressure." "What kind of pressure?" "The kind that comes from having resources most folks can't match. Legal pressure, financial pressure, social pressure." Doc Morrison paused meaningfully. "The kind of pressure that makes people feel like they have no choice but to accept whatever terms they're offered." Martha felt a chill of understanding. "He's not just coming after me, he's targeting other property owners too. Seems that way." Sarah Chen mentioned that she's had visitors asking about her store lease and whether she'd be interested in selling. The Petersons got an unexpected visit from a territorial tax assessor who found irregularities in their documentation. Folks are starting to feel nervous. Martha realized that Thomas's conspiracy was even larger than she'd initially understood. This wasn't just about her homestead, it was about systematically acquiring control of the entire region through intimidation and legal manipulation. "Doc, what would you say if I told you there might be a way to fight back, to give folks the information they need to protect themselves?" Doc Morrison studied her face carefully. "I'd say that sounds like a conversation we should have with Sarah Chen and maybe Pastor Williams. People facing common threats need to stand together, and you're going to need allies if you plan to take on interests with the kind of resources Thomas seems to represent." The next morning, Martha rode into Copper Creek, with Luke's survey notes hidden in her saddlebags and a plan beginning to form in her mind. Her first stop was the general store, where Sarah Chen was arranging bolts of fabric with the careful attention to detail that had made her business successful despite the challenges facing a Chinese woman in frontier Wyoming. "Martha," Sarah said, her face lighting with genuine warmth. "I've been thinking about you since yesterday. Such terrible news about Mr. McGraw." "Thank you, Sarah. Actually, that's part of why I'm here. I have something I need to show you, but it requires absolute discretion." Sarah's expression grew serious. "What kind of something?" Martha looked around the store, confirming they were alone, before pulling one of Luke's maps from her bag. The kind that explains why certain people have been asking so many questions about property ownership in Copper Creek. Sarah's eyes widened as she studied the detailed geological notations. "What am I looking at?" "A military survey that documents mineral deposits and water resources throughout this entire region. Resources that certain interests want to acquire, preferably without paying fair value for them." Sarah absorbed this information with the quick intelligence that had helped her survive as an immigrant businesswoman. "And they're using legal intimidation to force people to sell cheaply." "Exactly, but what they don't realize is that this information cuts both ways. They know what's valuable, but now we know it too." Martha pointed to specific notations on the map. "Your store sits on land with excellent access to the aquifer, which means you have water rights that would be essential to any large-scale development." Sarah studied the map more carefully, her business sense beginning to grasp the implications. Water rights are valuable, very valuable, especially if someone needs them for industrial purposes. Valuable enough that you could demand proper compensation for them, instead of being pressured into selling for a fraction of their worth. What about the others? The Petersons, the Williams family, the other ranchers? Martha spread out additional maps. Every property owner in this area has something that the development interests need: water rights, mineral access, transportation corridors. Individually, we're vulnerable to pressure and intimidation. But if we work together, if we understand what we really have, we become partners instead of victims. Sarah nodded slowly, her mind already working through the possibilities. "You're talking about organizing the entire community." "I'm talking about making sure everyone understands their real position before they make decisions they can't undo." Martha rolled up the maps carefully. "But Sarah, this information is dangerous. The people who want this land have already shown they're willing to use any means necessary to get it. If they discover what we know, they'll escalate their pressure." Sarah's voice carried the steel of a woman who'd faced intimidation before. "But Martha, we can't let fear stop us from protecting our homes and our futures. Too many of us have worked too hard to build something here, to let it be stolen through trickery and threats." That afternoon, Martha and Sarah met with Doc Morrison and Pastor Williams in the church vestry, spreading Luke's maps on the altar and explaining what they'd learned. Pastor Williams, a thoughtful man in his 60s who'd spent 15 years building his congregation, listened with growing alarm as the scope of the conspiracy became clear. "This explains so much," he said finally. "The territorial tax assessor who visited the church last month, asking about our land grant and whether we'd properly documented our claims. The questions about whether our congregation could afford to maintain the building if property values in the area changed significantly." Doc Morrison studied the maps with a physician's eye for detail. "If these surveys are accurate, we're sitting on resources worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, maybe more. The question is how we use that knowledge," Martha said. "We can try to negotiate with Thomas and his associates from a position of strength, or we can find ways to protect ourselves independently." "What about Luke?" Pastor Williams asked gently. "Do we have any hope of helping him with his legal troubles?" Martha felt her throat tighten at the mention of Luke's name. "I don't know, but I do know that the best way to honor what he's done for us is to make sure his sacrifice accomplishes something meaningful." Sarah Chen placed a gentle hand on Martha's shoulder. "We'll find a way to help him too, Martha. Men like Luke McGraw don't deserve to suffer for having principles." As evening fell over Copper Creek, Martha sat in her empty cabin with Luke's survey notes spread before her and her mother's china teacup, the last precious possession she'd been prepared to sell, sitting unused on the table. The cup represented her willingness to sacrifice everything for love and what truly mattered, but now she realized that sacrifice might not be necessary. Instead of selling her treasures to survive, she was learning to use the knowledge Luke had given her to build a future that honored both their feelings for each other and their commitment to protecting the community that had become their home. Tomorrow would bring the confrontation that would determine whether that future was possible, but tonight Martha Jane Holloway sat in her kitchen and planned for victory instead of mere survival. The bronze bell in the Copper Creek Community Church had summoned generations of worshippers to Sunday services, but on this Thursday morning in late April, its urgent pealing carried a different message entirely. Martha stood beside Pastor Williams as he rang the bell with steady, determined strokes, calling the townspeople to a gathering that would determine the future of their community. They came slowly at first, curious faces appearing in doorways, neighbors stepping onto porches to investigate the unusual summons. But as word spread through the small town that Martha Holloway had called an emergency meeting about threats to local property ownership, the church began to fill with settlers who'd spent years building lives they weren't prepared to surrender without a fight. Sarah Chen arrived early, carrying a ledger book that documented the various intimidation attempts community members had experienced over the past months. Doc Morrison came with his medical bag, as always, but also with a grim expression that suggested he understood the seriousness of what they were facing. The Peterson family arrived together, their faces showing the strain of recent legal pressures, while Jake Murphy from the saloon brought several of the ranch hands who'd been asking questions about their own job security. Martha stood at the front of the church, her hands steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to reveal. Behind her, spread across the altar, Luke's military survey maps represented both the source of their troubles and the key to their salvation. "Thank you all for coming," Martha began, her voice carrying clearly through the small sanctuary. "I know this is unusual, and I know some of you are wondering why a widow woman has presumed to call a community meeting. The truth is, I've learned something that affects every family represented in this room, and I believe you all deserve to know what we're really facing." She paused, looking out at the faces of neighbors who'd known her for decades, people who'd supported her through Samuel's illness and death, who'd offered help during her recent struggles, who'd accepted Luke's presence with the kind of tolerant understanding that frontier communities extended to their own. Most of you know that my brother-in-law Thomas has been challenging my claim to the homestead Samuel and I built together. What you might not know is that his interest in my land isn't motivated by family concerns or legal technicalities. It's motivated by what lies beneath the soil resources that he and his associates want to acquire as cheaply as possible. Martha gestured to the maps behind her. These are military survey documents that detail mineral deposits, water resources, and development opportunities throughout our entire region. They show that virtually every property in Copper Creek sits on resources worth far more than any of us realized. A murmur of surprise rippled through the congregation. Tom Bradley from the feed store leaned forward in his pew. "What kind of resources, Martha?" "Coal deposits that could fuel industrial development for decades, water rights that could supply mining operations, railroad construction, and territorial expansion. Transportation corridors that could determine the location of future towns and cities." Martha's voice grew stronger as she continued. "Gentlemen have been visiting all of you recently, asking questions about your property documentation, your financial situations, your willingness to consider selling. They've been testing your vulnerability because they know exactly what they want to acquire." Sarah Chen stood from her seat near the front. "Martha's right. I've been keeping track of the various approaches community members have received." She opened her ledger. "The Hendersons were told their water rights might be invalidated due to territorial boundary changes. The Williams family received notice that their grazing permits might not be renewed. 3 different families have been informed of supposed tax irregularities that could result in property seizures." Pastor Williams rose from his place near the altar. What Martha and Sarah are describing represents a coordinated effort to pressure our community into surrendering property rights without understanding their true value. This isn't merely business, it's a form of theft disguised as legal process. Jake Murphy's gravelly voice carried from the back of the church. So, what do we do about it? Most of us don't have the resources to fight territorial governments and railroad companies. Martha felt the weight of the community's attention focusing on her, and she understood that this moment would define not just her own future, but the fate of everyone who'd chosen to build their lives in this remote corner of Wyoming territory. We do what communities have always done when faced with threats too large for individuals to handle alone, she said. We stand together, we share information, we support each other through whatever legal challenges come our way, and we make sure that anyone who wants to acquire our resources pays fair value for them. She walked to the altar and picked up one of Luke's most detailed maps. These surveys show that the water rights alone for the properties represented in this room are worth more than most of us will earn in our lifetimes. The mineral rights could fund schools, churches, and infrastructure that would benefit our children and grandchildren. We don't have to be victims of circumstances we don't understand. Tom Bradley stood up slowly. Martha, what you're suggesting sounds like we'd be taking on some powerful interests, people with resources and connections most of us can't match. That's true, Martha acknowledged. But those same people have been counting on our ignorance and isolation to accomplish their goals cheaply. They've been assuming that we don't understand what we really have, and that we don't have the unity to defend it effectively. She looked around the church, meeting the eyes of neighbors who'd faced down blizzards, droughts, grasshopper plagues, and all the other challenges that frontier life could offer. I'm not asking anyone to do anything they're not comfortable with, Martha continued, but I am asking you to understand your real situation before you make decisions that can't be undone. Because once we sign away our rights to these resources, once we accept that we're powerless to protect what we've built, there won't be any going back. The church fell silent as the community absorbed the full implications of what Martha had revealed. Outside, the spring wind carried the sound of new life returning to the prairie, but inside, the people of Copper Creek faced a choice that would determine whether that new life would flourish under their stewardship or be harvested by strangers who saw their home as nothing more than a source of profit. The silence in the church stretched long enough for Martha to hear her own heartbeat, and then Jake Murphy's weathered voice cut through the tension like an axe through timber. Well, I'll be damned, he said, rising from his back pew with the deliberate movements of a man who'd made up his mind. Martha Jane, if what you're telling us is true, then we've all been played for fools by men who figured we were too ignorant to know our own worth. A murmur of agreement rippled through the congregation. Sarah Chen stood again, her ledger still open in her hands. I've been in business long enough to recognize when someone's trying to pressure me into a bad deal. The question is whether we're brave enough to call their bluff. Tom Bradley shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Sarah, it's easy to talk about calling bluffs when you're not the one facing federal tax liens and territorial boundary disputes. Some of us have been backed into corners where we might not have much choice. Martha understood Tom's fears. They were the same ones that had driven her to Murphy's saloon that desperate February night. But she also understood something now that she hadn't grasped then. Sometimes the only way through impossible circumstances was to change the rules of the game entirely. Tom, what if I told you that those tax liens and boundary disputes might not be as legally solid as they appear? Martha walked to the altar and selected another of Luke's maps, this one showing territorial survey markers and boundary lines. Luke McGraw wasn't just documenting mineral resources. He was also documenting discrepancies between official territorial surveys and the actual conditions on the ground. She pointed to specific notations on the map. Your property, Tom, sits on land that was surveyed incorrectly in the original territorial mapping. The boundary line that the tax assessor is using to challenge your claim is off by nearly half a mile, With proper documentation, you could prove that his assessment is based on fraudulent information. Tom's eyes widened as he studied the map. You're saying the government survey was wrong? I'm saying that Luke found dozens of survey errors throughout this region, probably because the original mappers were working quickly through unfamiliar territory. Men like Thomas are using those errors to create legal confusion that benefits their acquisition efforts. Pastor Williams moved closer to examine the maps. Martha, this information could potentially challenge property disputes throughout the entire territory. Exactly. Which means we're not just fighting for our individual homesteads, we're fighting to establish the principle that frontier communities have the right to accurate information and fair treatment under territorial law. The mood in the church began to shift as people realized they weren't facing their troubles alone. Doc Morrison stood up, his medical bag at his feet and his expression thoughtful. There's something else we need to consider, he said. If Martha is right about the scope of this conspiracy, then Luke McGraw is probably facing charges that are designed to prevent him from sharing this information publicly. His court-martial isn't just about desertion, it's about silencing the one person who could expose the whole scheme. Martha felt her throat tighten at the mention of Luke's situation. That's why we can't wait for someone else to solve our problems. Luke gave us the tools we need to protect ourselves, but using those tools is up to us. She reached into her coat pocket and withdrew the simple wooden wedding ring that Luke had carved for her during one of their evening conversations, a symbol of commitment built on understanding, respect, and true partnership rather than convention. She'd been carrying it since the day he was arrested, both as a reminder of what they meant to each other and as a promise to be worthy of his sacrifice. Luke McGraw came into my life through the strangest of circumstances, Martha said, holding the ring where everyone could see it. He didn't ask to be here, and he didn't owe me anything beyond the gambling debt that brought us together. But he chose to stay, and he chose to stand up for what was right, even when it meant risking his own freedom. She slipped the ring onto her finger beside Samuel's gold band, the contrast between the simple wood and precious metal, representing the different kinds of love that had shaped her life. I don't know if Luke will ever come back to Copper Creek, Martha continued, her voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm her. But I do know that the best way to honor what he's done for us is to prove that his sacrifice meant something, to show that a community of decent people can stand up to powerful interests when they understand their real strength. Sarah Chen closed her ledger with a decisive snap. Then let's stop talking and start planning. What exactly do we need to do? Martha looked around the church at faces that had shifted from uncertainty to determination. We need to document every property owner's real legal status using Luke's survey corrections. We need to coordinate our responses to legal challenges so that they can't pick us off one by one. And we need to make it clear to Thomas and his associates that we understand exactly what they're trying to do. Jake Murphy grinned, the expression transforming his weathered features. Sounds like we're about to give some fancy gentleman a frontier education in the difference between easy targets and a unified community. That's exactly what we're going to do, Martha agreed, and we're going to do it together. As the meeting continued into the afternoon, Martha felt something she hadn't experienced since Samuel's death. The strength that came from being part of something larger than herself. They were no longer isolated, individuals facing impossible odds. They were neighbors, friends, and allies, united in defense of the lives they'd built and the future they deserved. 6 months later, Martha stood at the garden gate Luke had built during the early days of autumn, watching the last of the season's harvest ripen under the Wyoming sun. The gate was a masterpiece of practical craftsmanship, sturdy enough to keep the deer out of her vegetables, beautiful enough to complement the wildflowers that had seeded themselves along the fence line, and welcoming enough to invite visitors into the abundance that now flourished behind it. The legal battles that had consumed the summer were finally settled. Thomas Holloway's challenges had crumbled under the weight of Luke's survey documentation and the unified resistance of the Copper Creek community. The territorial authorities, faced with overwhelming evidence of survey errors and coordinated fraud, had not only upheld the original homestead claims, but had also launched an investigation into the business practices of Thomas's associates. Several government officials had lost their positions, and at least one railroad executive was facing federal charges for conspiracy to defraud territorial property owners. Martha smiled as she remembered the telegram that had arrived 3 weeks ago, informing her that Luke's court-martial had resulted in full exoneration and restoration of his military rank. The Army, embarrassed by Colonel Webb's involvement in the land acquisition scheme, had not only dropped all charges against Luke, but had also awarded him a commendation for his principled stand against corruption. More importantly, the telegram had concluded with Luke's promise that he would be returning to Copper Creek as soon as his military obligations were complete. Doc Morrison approached the garden gate with his characteristic unhurried pace, his medical bag in one hand and a letter in the other. "Afternoon, Martha Jane. Got something here you'll want to see." Martha wiped her hands on her apron and accepted the letter, recognizing Luke's careful handwriting on the envelope. Inside, along with his usual account of military proceedings and legal developments, was news that made her heart race with anticipation. "My dearest Martha," she read aloud, "I am pleased to inform you that my discharge papers have been finalized, and I will be departing Fort Collins on October 15th. If the weather holds and the roads cooperate, I should reach Copper Creek by October 18th. I have given considerable thought to our future during these months of separation, and I hope you will find my proposals as appealing as I find the prospect of returning to the life we began building together." Doc Morrison grinned at Martha's obvious happiness. "Sounds like our wandering soldier is finally coming home." "It does indeed." Martha folded the letter carefully and tucked it into her apron pocket, next to the wooden ring she still carried, even though she now wore it openly on her finger. "Doc, would you mind spreading word that we might want to plan some kind of welcome celebration? Nothing fancy, but it would be nice if the community could show Luke how much we appreciate what he did for us." "I think that's a fine idea. Sarah Chen's been asking about Luke's return date anyway. She's got some kind of business proposition she wants to discuss with him." Martha raised an eyebrow. "Business proposition?" "Something about using his surveying skills to help establish proper property documentation for new settlers. Seems there's quite a demand for accurate boundary surveys. Now that word has spread about the importance of having reliable information." Doc Morrison paused meaningfully. "Course, that kind of work would require a man to settle down in one place permanently." Martha felt warmth spread through her chest at the implication. "I suppose it would." That evening, Martha sat on her front porch with a cup of coffee and Luke's letter, reading his words again as the sun set over the prairie. He wrote about his hopes for their future together, about his desire to help build something lasting in Copper Creek, about his plans to formally court her with all the respect and ceremony that their feelings deserved. But it was his final paragraph that brought tears to her eyes. "Martha, I want you to know that losing you would have been a greater punishment than any court-martial could have imposed. You gave me a reason to fight for what was right, and more importantly, you gave me a home worth fighting for. I love you with all the depth and permanence that a man can offer, and I promise to spend the rest of my life proving worthy of the trust you placed in me." Sarah Chen's voice interrupted her contemplation. "Martha, I hope I'm not intruding." Martha looked up to see her friend approaching with a wrapped package in her hands. "Not at all, Sarah. Come sit with me." Sarah settled into the chair beside Martha and handed her the package. "I wanted you to have this before Luke returns, something to mark the end of one chapter and the beginning of another." Inside, the wrapping was a beautiful piece of fabric, deep blue silk, embroidered with delicate wildflowers in shades of gold and green. "Sarah, this is gorgeous. But what's it for?" "Your wedding dress," Sarah said simply. "I know you and Luke haven't made formal announcements yet, but the whole community can see how you feel about each other." When the time comes, you should have something beautiful to wear for the ceremony." Martha held the silk up to catch the last of the evening light, marveling at the intricate needlework. "How did you know?" "Because I recognize love when I see it, and I recognize the kind of woman who deserves to celebrate that love properly," Sarah smiled. "Besides, after everything you've done for this community, we want to make sure your happiness is marked with all the joy and ceremony it deserves." 3 days later, on October 18th, Martha stood at her garden gate, wearing her new blue dress and watching the eastern horizon for signs of Luke's approach. The gate he'd built had weathered the summer storms and autumn winds without losing any of its strength or beauty, and Martha took that as a promising symbol for what they were building together. When she finally spotted the familiar figure on horseback, Martha's heart filled with a happiness so complete that she had to steady herself against the gatepost. Luke McGraw was coming home, not as a man working off a gambling debt, but as the partner she'd chosen and the future she'd fought to claim. As he drew closer, Martha could see that Luke was smiling, the first truly relaxed expression she'd seen on his face since the night they'd won each other at Murphy's card table. Behind him, she could see other riders, approaching members of the Copper Creek community, coming to welcome their defender home and to witness the beginning of the life he and Martha would build together. Martha opened the garden gate and stepped into the yard, ready to greet the man who taught her that sometimes the greatest treasures in life came disguised as unexpected responsibilities and that love was always worth fighting for, no matter what the odds.